Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be joined once again by Dr. Albert Palazzo, defense academic, and let me just check here, former Director of War Studies for the Australian Army. And Albert, you've got a new book coming out. By the time the public sees this, it will have just been out. It's coming out on the 16th of July, correct?
Yes, that's right. It's called the Big Fix: Rebuilding Australia's National Security.
Yeah, and it's quite an ambitious document at a time of I would say unprecedented strategic panic in Australia. So certainly, I think it's going to have some interested readers out there.
Well, yes, I hope so, and I hope it'll be able to contribute to the Australia's development of its defense policy. At the moment, I believe that we're on a very bad trajectory, and we need to do something dramatic to get into a position where Australia is actually able to defend itself.
Yeah, I have read the book, which is always helpful for an interview like this. I thought your potted history of Australian strategy and Australian military history was excellent in the first couple of chapters in the book. Um, in particular, you got in there on how we squandered the Treaty of Versailles, probably one of a rare moment of strategic independence by Australia. We really messed that up. Um, but it's a grim picture of Australia's history you paint, though. Not inaccurate, but it's a bit sad.
Well, it's also extraordinarily consistent.
Mm.
Since 1901, Australia has essentially had one defense policy. Now, no matter how many different defense reviews we've had and updates and recommitments, it always comes back to the same thing. That is to look to a great power partner to be our best buddy. And that used to be the United Kingdom, and then we got abandoned in 1941, and now it's the United States. And our defense policy
And we're going to get
consists,
abandoned in 2026.
that's distinctly on the cards. But our current defense policy is just simply to intensify the relationship with the United States on the assumption that they're going to help us.
Yeah, I like your points
And
about the status quo and how wants to maintain the status quo. However, the world isn't in a status quo type of mindset at the moment, and so us trying to pursue that at all costs might be a bit of a losing strategy.
oh, it definitely is. Australia is swimming against the tide of history, and you don't win when you do that. So, the government fully understands and tells us that the world is in a state of change, that is becoming more dangerous, that the security environment is becoming more complex, and the solution is to continue to do the same thing. Now, that is a losing approach. We need to do something different. And when circumstances change, you change, or else you lose. And this is just a fact that we can point out to countless cases in history where you lose if you don't adjust to the new environment. And the new
Yeah, and the point
environment,
you
our response is let's do the same thing.
yeah, and your point where you make of the Australian Defence is saying there's an imminent threat, but we're going to build our forces up over the next 30 years, saying, well, if there's an imminent threat, then don't you need your forces now rather than in 30 years' time?
Well, yes. I mean, we need to build up our defense forces. I don't argue against that. I believe we do need to do that. But the things that we're buying won't be here for 15, 20 years. And so there's no thread of logic in what the government is telling the Australian people. And that's why when in this book, The Big Fix, when I drill into the current policy, it just doesn't make any sense. In one level, or the Australian public is being sold a bill of goods here, for which there's no basis in reality. The basis is sentiment. We have always had a great power partner, and so we need a great power partner. And there's no sense that Australia can actually do something on its own.
Yeah, I was struck reading your book in that everything sort of comes back to 1941 in this country's story, and because America sort of stepped into the British role, albeit very unwillingly on America's part, Australia felt nothing had changed, and in fact, the relationship with Britain, which was one of essentially being the same people, and mass migration of British people to Australia. Um, was fundamentally utterly different to the client patron relationship with the US that was largely disinterested.
Yes, I mean, the Australian government likes to point out that, oh, we're old, good friends. It goes back to the Battle of Hamel in 1918, that Australian and Americans have stood side by side. And, this is an entirely misinterpretation of the relationship.
It's a
When
romantic
MacArthur arrived,
romantic interpretation of the relationship, whereby we pine and love America, whereas they might have noticed us once or twice, and that's about it.
yes, I mean, most Americans wouldn't be able to find Australia on the map of the globe, to be brutally frank.
To be fair,
And
they struggle
MacArthur
finding
understood,
their own country.
well, that is true too. But when MacArthur arrived in Melbourne in early 1942, two things occurred. One, Curtin made that great speech that we're turning now with, to the United States. But MacArthur gave the Curtin government a very direct and pointed message. He told Curtin that we're not here for Australia. I couldn't care less about Australia. Yeah, we're here because you're a convenient piece of real estate, and I'm going to go fight the Japanese from Australia. And if you get into any serious trouble, I don't really care. And
I've always
Australia
thought
never
MacArthur.
heard the second half of that message.
Yeah, I've always thought MacArthur was surprisingly kind to Australia for a man who has enormous failings. He was trying to nudge us in our own self-interest in a funny way, I thought. But one part of you that isn't in your book, and I get that it's more political history than defense policy, is that pretty much from the 1960s, every Australian Prime Minister who started thinking about independent strategy has been removed. Whitlam
Very
is the
quickly
famous
removed.
one. But we can go back to Gorton. We can go through it. It's both sides of politics, Labor and what we call the Liberal Party, the Conservatives here. So John Gorton, Gough Whitlam, and then they just towed the line for a long time. And then I would argue Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard and Malcolm Turnbull all stepped out of line and were swiftly removed as a basis. And I mean, it came out in the Snowden and WikiLeaks stuff. We've got members of Parliament who are protected CIA sources, and they that when the whistle gets blown, they just move the Prime Minister out. So it's not a winning political move to start thinking independently, and I suspect that might be the root cause of why we have this atrophied strategy view in Australia.
I sort of disagree somewhat,
Hmm.
because I think it's actually worse than what you're portraying. I mean, I gave a talk in Perth about this. And essentially, I think there's an element of laziness and an element of lack of imagination. Looking to America is very easy. Protecting your country, dealing with defense is very difficult. This is a hard job. And it's the most important and single purpose for why we actually have a government. And
So
it
you think
requires a
the
lot of energy and work. And
so you think the
to be
Australian
brutal,
attitude of saying she'll be right, mate, is a bit of a problem for us. We don't have enough
oh
hard-minded
yeah,
people who
yeah,
actually want to do the work.
yes, there are definite cultural factors in Australia's dependence on the United States, and there's definitely anti-intellectual factors that underpin its dependency on the United States. And frankly, handing over our security to the United States is simply easy, and it's also cheap. So, and that was very valid but it's now changing. The circumstances are changing. And the cost of the security that the United States, that illusion of security, is going up. And we don't seem to be aware of this, or our leaders don't seem to be aware of it, is that the cost of the relationship is now unfavorable to Australia.
And I
Yeah.
do like
Sorry, go, Rob.
I do like that. Not only do you go through these points in your book and how there are these issues, but you also go into, well, here are some ideas and some process to go forward for the Australian military and for the government, and these are some of the choices they can make that still maintain the special relationship, that still maintain Australia's sovereignty, which is something we've given up on, and still maintain the ability to build a good defence, and that's really useful to get people thinking. If they actually are getting around, if I hope more people read the book so that they can have these ideas of saying, well, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we getting more uncrewed systems like the Foxbat and Stingray and everything else? They're developing them and building the technology, but why aren't they looking to actually fund them rather than just announcing them, but actually putting the funding in, which is what you've pointed out, saying all these deliverables that are being announced, but no funding is provided for them.
Yeah, I'll let you in on one of the great secrets of the Australian Defence Force. Most people assume that the function of the Australian Defence Force is to defend Australia. And that's not true. The Australian Defence Force we're building is meant to be a sub element of the US Defense Force. Our Navy is designed to integrate with the US. Our Air Force is essentially a wing of the US Air Force. And our soldiers are very comfortable working under the command of American commanders. And we integrate ourselves at all levels into the American system. And it's actually quite impossible for Australia, the Australian Defence Force, to fight on its own. It can't do it. It has to be part of the American network in order to be able to function. And we're making this even worse because the government objective now is to be interchangeable with the American military. Now that's unprecedented. Nobody has ever done that before. The word used to be interconnected,
Interoperable.
interoperable. Interchangeable means you have the same interests, you have the same strategy. And our government seems to have forgotten that we're actually different countries with different values and different interests. And so we can't be interchangeable. And we need a defense force whose primary purpose is to defend Australia. And that's not what we're getting.
Yeah, I one of the things I did like was the simplicity with which you laid out in the book that, and it's bloody obvious when you look at a map, but we don't seem to think of it too often, is that we're a large island continent with significant air-sea gaps, and defending Australia should be a matter of having systems to defend that air-sea gap and be on the strategic defensive, I think is the term you use. And yeah, obviously that would require a very different sort of defense force, but it's entirely doable for less than the cost of these submarines.
Oh, absolutely. Not only can we defend Australia on our own by embracing the new technologies that are coming, but we can probably do it for less. I mean, our current obsession with acquiring nuclear powered submarines is basically cannibalizing the defense budget, and we're seeing all kinds of other things being neglected or postponed. Just recently, we decided, the Department of Defense decided to postpone the development of a capability to make 155 artillery rounds in Australia. This is one of the simplest things to make. I mean, the world's been doing it since 1941. Yet we don't do it here because
Yeah, and
it's not the priority.
And they're the most common things that are getting shipped to Ukraine at the moment, and probably Russia. And in the case of everybody in the world wants them, and you need lots of them if you're in any sort of conflict. And suddenly we're not
Yes.
producing them.
So, as I say in the book, what Australia needs to start with is first coming, just accepting a different cultural rationalization for defense policy. And that's where what is called the strategic defensive. Right now, we're a sub element of the US military. What we need to adopt is the strategic defensive, which is I need to point out that I'm not inventing this. It's not a term I've coined. It's been around for centuries, or longer. It's been used in countless times and successfully. And for Australia, it's the ideal military philosophy. And with us being an island and distant from the centers of real tension in the world, and also with the new weapons that are coming online that favor the defense, being a defensive state makes a lot of sense for Australia. It may not make sense for the United States. They're an offensive power, but it doesn't make any sense for us to be an offensive power. And when you become a defensive power, things change. You buy different stuff, you think differently, you train differently, and you become, a sovereign country whose military exists for the protection of its own people.
Yeah, now you do make some, shall we say, modest proposals for the future of Australian defence in the book. Abolishing the Navy, certainly seems like quite
Not abolishing the Navy, just reducing the number of crewed vessels. So yes, you're not going to have as many commanders on board their own ships being, yeah. But yes, there are
Well,
plenty of.
We talk about how circumstances are changing, how the world is changing. And for the Navy, and it's really for the Navy, the biggest changes are occurring at sea. But our Navy doesn't realize this, or if they realize it, they refuse to accept it. Our Navy is like the horse soldiers of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Mechanization is coming. The future is with armor and the internal combustion engine. But our Navy is insisting on, don't worry, we're still relevant. We're going to keep doing exactly what we do. And this is a doomed initiative. So our plans to build nuclear powered submarines and surface combatants, which it's going to cost us, $500 billion, $500 billion, is pointless. And the reason it's pointless is because the purpose of warships has always been to control the sea. You control the sea from the sea with warships that fought other warships. But the big change that we're facing today is not, drones and precision weapons. Now, that's part of it. That's the tech side of it. But the biggest change we're facing is that it's now possible to control the important parts of the sea from the land and from the air. And that means surface warships are now doomed, and submarines also doomed. So let's not build them. Let's build stuff that can control the sea from the land and from the air. And so we'll still have a Navy, but the Navy will consist of, thousands of uncrewed platforms of various sizes and purposes. And most of the Navy will be ashore in, stations controlling these platforms from the shore. So there's still going to be sailors. It's just that they won't stride across the deck, the bridge of a massive warship and feel the powerful vibrations through the soles of their feet. They're going to be underground somewhere, underground in a bunker.
That'll be the Army's job nowadays with the literal warfare. It'll be the Army going from sea to shore and shore to sea. So it'll be a bit of a change of role for the two of them.
Yes, for now, all the services will be changing in form and function. And since Australia is surrounded by water, we're an island. controlling the sea is the most important element of our defense policy. And we don't need to do that with expensive and vulnerable warships. You just do it from the land.
Uh,
And yeah, go ahead, John.
oh no, I was just going to ask, given that we are a tank podcast, where do you see certainly the future of the Australian Army and in this system that you're envisaging?
Well, Australia, the Australian Army still has a very critical role to perform here. In the first place, a lot of these land, a lot of these, excuse me, the Australian Army is acquiring the HIMARS missile. We need to acquire them in bigger numbers, but we're getting them. And this is one of the ways you control the sea. These missiles can reach out over the water and sink anybody that's coming our way. And being a truck-borne platform, not only are they easy to hide, but they're also relatively easy to move. You can ship them overseas or offshore, so you can extend the range. But ultimately, we also want missiles that can strike further than HIMARS. So HIMARS is, you know, uh, HIMARS is the first step of gaining a resurgence of, let's say, coastal defense. That's basically
Uh,
what it is. And we need missiles that will strike much further offshore.
But we're going to
I
need a
like
lot
it.
of them as well, aren't we? Because if you're going to defeat a naval task force that's, got, say, the Chinese might be sending, just as the hypothetical enemy, not that I think the Chinese are going to invade us, a task force with a dozen destroyers and cruisers, then it can probably intercept, several dozen missiles. So
Yes.
we're going to need to be firing hundreds of these things
Oh,
to
yes.
have an effect.
Yes. Yes. You need mass, but you also still need a joint force. So any hostile task force trying to operate in what Australia's waters, or the waters that are of Australia's interest, will need to confront an Australian Defence Force that jointly operates sea-based weapons, uncrewed weapons. These will be smart mines, smart missile launches, mini submarines that are all controlled remotely. It'll also need to confront with incoming waves of land-based missiles and also air-delivered missiles, plus fleets of drones and other things that we throw at them. So the Australian Defence Force doesn't go away. It remains being a joint dry service, and you add space in there too, a quad service, jointly trying to defend the approaches to Australia.
And
And
as you're saying,
this is
in
very doable.
in the
Yeah,
book,
Rob?
you also point out in the book that, as John was saying, being a tank podcast, we're interested in the armored fighting vehicle side of things. So you point out in the book that, yeah, we definitely need tanks and we definitely need armored fighting vehicles in order to protect the people who are going to
Yes.
be manning all these things, because there's no point being sitting in a unarmored truck or out in the open when enemy firepower comes in. You need to be in a protected vehicle in order to survive and keep going.
Yes, nothing in the current trajectory of war suggests that Australia has been granted an exemption from violence, from lethal combat. And so, if you want to, operate in this battle space, you need protection. And whether that protection is a tank or an infantry combat vehicle, you need it. Otherwise, you just die. And anybody who says that we don't need tanks, we don't need infantry fighting vehicles, is basically saying they don't mind that soldiers die in large numbers. And because we're going to still need these people, and the defense of Australia can be done from like as a coastal command operation, but the other threat that we're facing, which the government consistently ignores, is the national security threat of climate change. And I believe this is a much more dangerous threat to Australia than China. China has no interest in doing anything hostile to to Australia. And the more American bases that we build here, we're foolishly making ourselves into a target. We're telling the Chinese, please attack us. But they don't really have an interest in doing that. There's no benefit to them for that. But climate change is a much different and much more dangerous threat. And the reason why it's a threat is that across our region, we have a lot of countries that are, let's say, fragile, socially fractious, resource dependent. And as climate change reduces the global food supply, these countries are going to come under enormous threat and enormous tension and stress. And some of them will come apart. And I think the future in our region is going to be much more violent than we're used to. And as a result, what we called in Somalia ungoverned space. Ungoverned spaces will appear across our region. And our government will have to decide what it's going to do about it, because there's no advantage to Australia to have tracts of ungoverned spaces nearby. And so I believe that that's what the Army is going to be principally, its second equally relevant task will be to be dispatched by the government into the regions to help prop up governments, to help control ungoverned spaces, to stand between warring parties and bring about a restoration of some semblance of peace. And that's going to require, heavy firepower and protection, because it's war. And, that's what wars look like. They're messy and they're violent and they're deadly. And so you need this equipment to help bring about peace and hold the region together as climate change forces states into states of unrest and social disintegration. So it's not a very pleasant future. I'm aware of that. But this is the trajectory climate change will take us to.
Yeah, look,
Yeah.
climate change will displace a lot of people, as you say, because of droughts, running out of food, water, and everything else. So from that, people then move to different areas, and that will then cause stress on on governments and people in those areas are saying, look, we just want to be able to live and survive. And so displaced people are going to be moving and causing issues throughout these governments. And you're right, Australia's going to have to make a choice whether or not we get involved on where the issues are happening, or get involved when these people start looking to come to Australia and say, look, we can't survive where we were. We need somewhere else. And Australia looks approachable. No matter how many saltwater crocodiles there are, there's probably better than where they left.
Yes, absolutely. Australia is a potential magnet for people in the region, because when the place where you are is no longer survivable, you have a choice. You either move or you die. And then, people will make both choices. But the ones who move, Australia's got to decide, what are we going to do about them?
Yeah, I'm always struck by the way that in historical terms, the movement of the peoples is code for the end of the world, or the end of civilization. It's no
Those
small
damn sea
thing.
peoples.
Yeah. Um, speaking of the sea though, just quickly, you do talk in the book about for big picture strategy for Australia as a trading nation, we're utterly reliant on foreign shipping lines who will not come near us if we're under any sort of maritime embargo or blockade, I should say. So in terms of strategy, building up a sovereign shipping fleet seems like something we really, really, really should be doing. But traditionally, Australian governments hate maritime unions, and are we? Do you think we're ever going to get past that, or we're just going to leave that waiting until there's a crisis?
Well, a few years ago now, I think it's just perhaps only 3 years ago, the Australian government commissioned a study into building up a national maritime fleet. And the recommendation was that, oh, we probably could use 12 ships, which is just nonsense. I mean, it doesn't solve even a fraction of the problem. For the last year that statistics are available. 6,000 ships called in an Australian port. And we think, oh, 12, that's the number. So that's a solution to nothing. Um, should we have a national fleet? Uh, I don't think there's the interest, the desire, or the money in doing it. So I don't expect it to happen. But we can solve a lot of these problems by just building up our internal resilience. And there are certain industries that are just critical that need to be built up and supported. And I'll identify a couple of them, such as, fertilizer. If you want food, you need fertilizer. It's that simple. And we have the ability, we have a few plants that make it, and we should make sure that those plants survive, even if they need to be taken over by the government. And our other critical, shortage is diesel fuel, which all of it comes from overseas. And now there's a solution to diesel and petroleum and petrol. It's called electrification. So if we electrify our transport fleet, then we don't have to worry about the collapse of Australian civilization. Because I'll tell you, right now, if our diesel fuel is interrupted from coming from overseas, supermarkets will be out of food in about 2 weeks. And you can imagine what happens when supermarkets don't have food in Australian cities.
Yeah, the movement of
So
the
we can be
peoples comes to
smart
mind
about
here.
this.
Yeah.
So,
I think
we can the trade issues are manageable with a degree of imagination, common sense, and a commitment by the government to, take on, the fossil fuel industries and electrify the economy.
yeah, just before
We could
we
easily be a global powerhouse of energy.
that would be
Sorry,
the
John, go
dream.
ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I was just going to say, one thing that struck me in recent developments, particularly looking at Israel, Iran, Ukraine, Russia, is that all of these new drone capabilities are essentially driven by whether Alibaba will ship to you. None of these countries can build these weapons without the Chinese shipping huge quantities of components to them, which does make war with China a particularly losing proposition, I would have thought. But
Yeah, yeah, you
uh,
think, yeah.
I guess the question is if we're thinking of fighting a war, we need adequate stockpiles, which is something we've never been very good at either, because traditionally the supply has been left to our great power allies.
That's true. Exactly. Our critical component supply lines all go through the great powers. If you want to be sovereign, you have to make microchips, and we don't do that. Um, so clearly, the solution here is not going to war with China. There's not going to be any winners in such a conflict. There's going to be a lot of losers, and Australia, needs to be a vehicle for promoting accommodation and resolution of tensions between the great powers. We just can't be on the sidelines being a cheerleader or a mini me for the United States. Because nothing is more foolish in the future than to have a war between great powers. We used to understand this during the Cold War. Everyone recognized the possibility of a war between Russia and between the Soviet Union and the United States would be the end of the world. Now, it's the same thing. A war between the United States and China, if it crosses the nuclear escalation threshold, which is very probable, I would say, then we're looking at the end of the world. And yet we have these cheerleaders who, think having a war between China and the United States is a great thing. And hey, we want to be there too, just like in Vietnam. Let's go.
Yeah, I've always been impressed by the way Liechtenstein in I think 1912 decoupled themselves from the Austrian Empire and signed up with Switzerland, and in the process became one of the richest countries on earth by staying the hell out of World War One. And yeah. Okay, Rob, you got any other questions?
I have lots, but I think we better give Al back his day because, as I said before, I could talk about this all day. Had a lot of fun learning about the transparency of the sea and how submarines won't be able to work anymore. How we need to protect our cyber space because essentially that's going to, if we're going to be having any of these uncrewed systems going, then we need to be able to control them from somewhere. And to do that, you need secure cyber. And how are we going to pay for all this? Because the government loves to announce things. But doesn't actually
Mm-hmm.
fund them. So these are all things that Al discusses in his books and solutions for them and what we should be doing. So encourage everybody who's listening and seeing us to go out and get the book once it's out. And it was a good read and I really appreciate it, Al. Thank you.
Yes, it'll be out on 16 July. Just go to your local bookshop.
Or
The
it
Big
is on
Fix.
Amazon. Yep.
The Big Fix, it's called.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes,
Thanks very much, Al.
Rob, John, it's been a pleasure. Always happy to chat with you.
We'll see you at the pub next month.